Welcome to the Australian Hiker Podcast, Australia's longest running hiking podcast, downloaded over 750,000 times in 155 countries and providing you with an Australian perspective on all things hiking. We're your hosts, Tim and Jules Savage, coming to you from Ngunnawal and Ngambri country.
This is episode 244 of the Australian Hiker Podcast. And in this week's episode, we go through the great debate, boots versus trail runners. We hope you enjoy. Before we get into today's episode, if you'd like to help support Australian Hiker and this podcast, there are a couple of ways that you can help us out. Firstly, by subscribing on your podcast host of choice so that each episode is available as soon as it's published. And if you have the opportunity, leave us a 5-star review. Another way to support us is go to the Australian Hiker website at www.australianhiker.com.au and click on the Support Us page and buy us a coffee. You can do a one-off donation or become a monthly supporter. All donations are greatly appreciated and help us to continue producing this podcast and blog. Now let's get on to today's episode. Without a doubt, one of the most common discussions I hear in hiking circles, both on trail as well as online forums, is what type of footwear should hikers be wearing? While this discussion includes questions around footwear brands, by far the most common theme is, what should I be wearing, trail runners or boots? In the past, the response to this question would have been a shorter and simpler discussion, but these days with such a huge range of footwear styles and models available on the market, the answer isn't a simple one and can be confusing for newer hikers. So what type of footwear should you be wearing? Now, let's go through the types or availability of different footwear for hiking available on the market. And we'll start off with the heavier versions and move our way lighter. So first and foremost, we're going to go through and look at boots. Now, 5-10 years ago, when you went through and discussed boots, really you were talking about things that were large, heavy, typically leather or some sort of leather substitute, but that was what the typical boot tended to look like. But these days, there is quite a range in what we consider to be boots, and we'll go through and look at what those actually are. So the first one we're going to look at is leather hiking boots. And these are the traditional heavy boots that most people are used to. And if you think about hiking in boots, particularly if you're new to the activity, this is what you're going to have a picture of your mind in. Big, heavy, quite often expensive, but not always, but the traditional uniform for hikers.
And I think often it's probably the place where most people are encouraged to start. And, we'll talk a little bit about that. But, it really does depend on the circumstances and the kinds of trails that you'll be hiking in.
So certainly from my perspective, I actually own 4 pairs of boots at the moment. And one of those happens to be a very heavy grade leather boot. In fact, my size 14 US boots weigh 2.1 kilo for the pair. And traditional acceptance of the impact of footwear on a hiker is for every pound or every kilo on the foot, that's 5 times the impact on what you're carrying in your pack. So my 2.1 kilo boots is the equivalent of carrying roughly 10.5 kilos of extra weight on my back. Now, certainly, no footwear weighs nothing. There's always some weight involved in that. But carrying through and using heavy grade leather boots, it does have a physical impact on you as hikers. Having said that, though, there are a number of advantages to using a heavy grade leather boot. And for me, I don't tend to wear them that often. I'm typically wearing them in conditions where I am in the snow and I want a very weather-proof, snow-proof boot that's going to keep me warm and protected.
And keep your feet dry in those conditions.
Yeah. So, I think the last time I wore my heavy leather boots was winter 2020.
Yeah, I think 2020, and we went snowshoeing.
Yeah. So it's not a common thing that I tend to wear. Now, apart from protection from the cold, heavy grade boots also provide a fair amount of protection for your feet and your ankles as well. So if you're hiking in very rugged terrain where there's lots of roots, there's lots of boulders or rocks or talus fields where you are potentially going to trip or sprain your ankle because there's a moving ground underneath you, a heavy grade leather boot isn't a bad way to go. But for me, that's the only times that I go through and tend to wear my heavy boots. One other negative or a couple of other negatives of heavy grade leather boots tends to be the cost. My boots recommended retail, if I were to purchase them again today, is just on $550. But they are a long-lasting boot. And I know my previous boots that these ones replaced were around about 8 years old. So certainly they are durable and probably in the long run, they're probably better value for money because I know that I replace my current trail runners much more frequently than that.
Yeah, that's right. And my leather boots are quite old now and not at all starting to look as if they're wearing, and they'll last a little bit longer, but I guess these days I don't wear them that often.
The other thing that's worthwhile considering as well, again, if it's in really hot conditions, so you're hiking the Larapinta Trail, not unusual to be getting 32 degrees Celsius temperature at any time of the year, if not hotter. And if you've got a heavy grade leather boot on, your feet tend to get fairly hot. They can actually tend to sweat, and that's when you potentially can get blisters. Even going for a thinner sock, you're still going to overheat, or more than likely going to overheat in really hot conditions. The other thing we mentioned, they're waterproof, and typically a good quality leather grade boot that's been maintained is waterproof in most cases. But if you're walking through water, there's a large hole on the top of them where your legs go into the boots. And if you actually are going deep enough that you're submerging the top of the boots, they're going to get water in them. You're going to have to stop and empty the water out, and they're not going to dry out that quickly. And in all honesty, if I'm going through and wearing a pair of leather boots on a river crossing, I will stop and take my socks off, so at least I can actually empty the water out, dry out the boots as best as I can with an absorbent small little towel, and then put the socks back on again. But even then, they do take a long time to dry out. So again, the potential is if you're doing river crossings, getting the moisture inside your boot, moisture and heat often equal friction, and that's where the blisters tend to occur. So having said that, though, I have a mountain not far behind me that I walk up on a fairly regular basis and have done for many years. It's one of the areas I use to test out footwear in because there's a slope there that's about 1 in 4. So every 4 metres you're increasing about 1 metre in height. When it's wet, it becomes really slippery. When it's dry, it becomes really powdery and becomes really slippery. And the fastest time I have ever done up that trail was in a pair of heavy leather grade boots because they just gave me the feeling of being bolted to the ground. I had supreme traction. Just really felt like I wasn't slipping or sliding anywhere. And this is probably one of the few pairs of footwear that they actually do this. But again, if you're trying to do big distances, a heavy grade boot does tend to slow you down. And I know that when I did the Bibbulmun track, as an example, I was averaging 32 kilometres a day. I wouldn't have been able to do that in a heavy grade leather boot. You just can't get the pace and the speed that you can do with a lighter weight pair of footwear. From there, we shift into something slightly lighter, and we're still looking very similar to the heavy grade leather boots. But in this case here, they're a lighter weight version, often a Gore-Tex material, or in most cases they're a suede leather looking material, and there's so many different types of these on the market. Just about every company produces them. Mm-hmm. These do tend to be lighter, and I think in the case of the pair that I actually wear, they're around about 500 grams lighter than my leather boots. So again, that's taking a bit of the weight and the impact off the body. They're just as comfortable because my leather boots are very comfortable, but these ones are just as comfortable. And they just give you a bit more versatility. So again, they still, if you look after them, they still are reasonably waterproof. They still will work well in the snow and wet conditions, but they just have less weight on them. And when it came time to buy these boots, the reason I bought them was I was planning on doing a hike where I was expecting potentially to be walking in anything up to about 1 metre of snow. So I wanted to have a boot that was going to keep me warm and dry, keep me protected, and I opted, rather than using my leather boots, I opted for these ones. And in all honesty, if I was only going to buy one pair of boots, and I do say boots here, these would be the ones that I would buy. So when my leather boots wear out in the future, when these ones wear out, I'll replace them with that suede leather style of boot.
Yeah, and that style of boot was the boot that I wore when we were doing snowshoeing, and rather than the leather boots that I have. And, you know, for all those things and for all those reasons that Tim mentioned, you get the protection, you get the sturdiness, you get the warmth, but a lot less weight in your boot, and a little bit more comfort as well.
Moving on from there, we've got two categories, I suppose, for want of a better term, in relation to boots. So this is not an official thing, but from my perspective, what I see on the market, there appears to be four different sort of grades or categories within the boot market. So we've already talked about the heavy leather boots. We've already talked about the suede leather boots, which are a bit lighter. Now we move on to what we really class as lightweight and probably even light to midweight sort of boots. These are essentially a trail runner that has got an additional extension up the leg, so they're boot looking. You wouldn't confuse these for being a trail runner or a running shoe, but again, there's two categories of these. One which is relatively heavy, but much lighter than the two previous versions we've talked about. And the other one is very lightweight, almost as light as a pair of trail runners, but not quite. Now, where these boots have come from is from most manufacturers will often produce trail runners, and a lot of them are starting to produce a boot version of those trail runners. So I've given two examples in the written article of this podcast, and one is a boot that's been based on a trail runner, but it is not, rather than being soft and pliable like most trail runners are, this is a bit more of a halfway point between a trail runner and a suede leather boot. They don't tend to come up as high up the leg. They don't tend to be anywhere near as heavy as the suede leather boots or the leather boots themselves. They do tend to be a bit more rigid, but they certainly are getting down in weight and making things a bit more comfortable.
Yeah, and because they're not as high, for those who are looking for ankle protection, they won't give you as much ankle protection as well, because they're not coming up high enough around your ankle.
Then we move on to the really lightweight boots, and these really are a trail runner that just have a slightly higher piece of material, higher cut that comes up the leg. Now, I own a trail runner version of this boot, and I also own the boot version. The sole, the construction of the actual footwear themselves, very much the same. Really, the difference tends to be that it's coming up the leg further, providing a bit more support. I find they tend to dry relatively quickly when they do get wet. So if you are doing river crossings, they're not going to dry as quickly as a standard trail runner, but they dry reasonably quickly. They do help to keep dirt and dust and muck out of the inside of the footwear. So whereas with a trail runner, I will wear a Lycra gaiter to do that. With these ones, I don't need to. And if it's a really cold sort of condition, so if you're walking through really frosty sort of grass, it helps to keep your feet just a bit drier and a bit warmer.
So I guess my issue with this kind of shoe, and if you go to the show notes, there's an article that you can look at that's got some images. But my issue with this kind of low, higher cut trail runner, I guess, is how I describe it, is they're a little bit clown-like in terms of the sorts of shoes a clown would wear, you know. So they're a bit floppy, and they've just got a top on them. I just don't get it anyway. So don't really give you the sturdiness, short of reducing the amount of grit that you're going to get into your shoe. I don't quite see the point of them, but anyway.
And I think the thing with them is I do find even with the really lightweight version of this style of boot, they still do restrict your movement. And I found that I'd gone from wearing the trail runner version of this straight into wearing the boot version, and I found that my ankle movement was restricted, which did slow me down. So it's the sort of thing that it's an option, and we'll talk about which way you should look at and the things to consider when picking some footwear. But certainly, that sort of rounds off the four different sort of categories of boots themselves. Now we'll move on to trail runners. And again, for people that have been into hiking for a while or people that are used to trail running, they'll know what they are. But for a lot of people, they're not quite sure what the term trail runner means. And I suppose the best way to think about this is it's a running shoe that you use to go jogging or running, but it's designed to be worn on natural trails. So rather than concrete or bitumen or grass, you're wearing this on formed trails. You might be walking through mud, you might be walking through tree roots, and you need something that's a bit more robust, a bit more sturdy, has a bit more grip.
Yeah, so the undersole is souped up and often has a much more robust and knobbly kind of undersole.
In addition, you'll tend to find there's a bit more protection on the toe in case you kick or stumble over rocks or kick timber.
Limited, but it's there.
It's there. Yeah. And it also has a bit more protection on the heel as well. And the material, not always, but quite often the material tends to be a bit more durable because you're in an environment that is a bit less forgiving than running around the suburbs. And I think probably the biggest thing with these shoes really is the traction on them. So, running along roads, you don't need a huge amount of traction. Running in conditions where it can be slippery or really muddy, or it's slippery because it's really dry and powdery, having that extra traction makes a big difference. The advantage with trail runners is there's a huge range on the market from a number of different companies. The size and shapes vary. The cushioning that's available from being really plush to a bit more of a standard sort of conditioning. Zero drop, and when we talk about zero drop, we mean there's no drop from the heel to the toe, it's just flat. Or the standard sort of shoes which tend to have a drop roughly around about the 8 to 10 millimetres from heel to toe. So you've got a lot more versatility in these. Typically trail runners are cheaper, but not always. My dearest pair of trail runners at the moment is $320 Australian at the time of this podcast. So, two of those will surpass a pair of leather boots, and they won't last as long as leather boots either. So for me, I do roughly around about 3,000 kilometres a year in walking and hiking. And for me, that means I will typically go through about 5 pairs of trail runners, averaging sort of around about the 700 kilometres per pair of trail runners.
So for me, I do less kilometres, but I do find the conditions are the things that wear my shoes out. So not just hard trails, but things like if you've spent a bit of time walking through mud or if you're scrambling, particularly in and around Blackberry and those kinds of things, the trail runners do deteriorate pretty quickly in those conditions.
From my perspective, where my trail runners tend to die is the cushioning and support under the midfoot in particular tends to go, and you can feel it. So, you come back from a walk and your feet are sore, whereas they didn't used to be from doing something similar. The outside of my shoes, unless I've been doing some really muddy hiking, looks in really good condition. I think in my life I've only ever worn out one pair of trail runners because the top's given away. And that was on my recent South Coast track trip in Tasmania. But these were trail runners that had a reasonable life anyway, so they did get a quite a good sort of length of life and probably close on 1,000 kilometres. But, for 500, 600, 700,000 kilometres, depending on the type of trail runners you go for, is probably about it. So you will need to replace these more often. And
also, if you're keeping them for several years, they will deteriorate as well. So even if you're not wearing them, that doesn't mean that they are static. They will age even if they're not being worn. So it is a bit of a toss-up. I think they're much more comfortable. That's what I hike in, what I walk in, and when I've worn out a pair for hiking, they become my gardening shoes. I've got a few pairs of gardening shoes at the moment. So, you kind of manage them, but they're not going to last the way the leather boots are going to last, but they are much more comfortable, I think.
Yeah, and without a doubt, I mean, if comfort is the priority, this is definitely the way to go. There's no doubt about that. Okay, now we've been talking about boots and we've been talking about trail runners, and now also throw something else into the mix, and that's hiking shoes. Hiking shoes are reasonably common, although you may not necessarily call them that, and these are essentially, they look like trail runners or a pair of running shoes, but they have a much more rigid sole. They tend to be a much more rigid and durable upper, and in all honesty, there are some brands and some models which are probably the biggest sellers of any type of hiking shoe worldwide on the market and have been for years because people just know them. They sell really well, but they are a bit more rigid. And from my perspective, hiking shoes do not have the traction that either boots or trail runners tend to have.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I had probably a couple of pairs along the way, and really they just didn't hold me to the ground, and also because of that rigidity, I didn't find them very comfortable. So if you've got a boot on and it's rigid, it's a bit different to a shoe that's rigid. So they certainly weren't for me, and the main reason was the lack of traction.
Having said that, though, they are a bit more durable.
Everybody wears them.
Everybody wears them.
I don't know why.
I find that if I'm wearing a pair of hiking shoes, I'll typically get about 1,000 to 1,200 kilometres. Now, for a lot of people, that might be 2 or even 3 years worth of use. But certainly for me, I'd still go through 3 pairs of these on a given year. The question was boots versus trail runners, and I think, from my own personal use, I very much am in the trail runner camp. As I said, I do over 3,000 kilometres a year in boots or trail runners, and probably 95% of that is in trail runners. I'm quite happy to spend the money because of the amount of time that I'm actually out there. I want to be comfortable. I like making a fashion statement, and trail runners come from being very plain and boring looking to being very leery.
Bright orange.
Bright sort of colours. So, again, from my perspective, I really just do find that I'm so much more comfortable in trail runners, and if you're comfortable, you'll enjoy your hike more. Having said that, though, if I'm going snowshoeing, if I'm going in conditions where I'm walking over large boulder fields and ankle care is a real consideration, I will shift into boots. If I'm doing a hike where I expect to be going through not just a couple of centimetres of snow, but halfway up the calf sort of snow, I definitely will wear boots. But so in that respect, I very much, as I said, am a trail runner person. But I do, as I said earlier on this podcast, own 4 pairs of boots. And there's 1 pair out of that I will particularly choose when I have the option.
Yeah, so I'm a little bit similar. I'll, as a general rule, opt for the trail runners. If grit is going to be an issue, I'll wear a pair of Lycra gaiters the way Tim does. If cold's going to be an issue, if wet's going to be an issue, I'll wear what I would consider a hybrid boot, which is essentially one of the suede-looking boots, which is a little bit more rigidity than any of the trail options, but not a leather boot.
Yeah, and I mean, I must admit, from my perspective as well, as I said, I own 4 pairs of boots. Really, if I am given a choice, there's one of those 4 that I'll pick every time, and I'll leave the others a just-in-case sort of thing. So I'm not going to throw them out because they're still in good condition. But as I said, when it comes time to when all 4 pairs have died and I have to replace them, I will actually end up going for another pair of Gore-Tex or the suede leather sort of boots, simply because I think I like the extremes. The lightweight trail runner style boot, as I said, from my perspective, I just don't get it. I prefer the trail runners or the boot, not a halfway point in the middle.
Yeah, me too. And, I think the main thing here is, for me, I actually struggle to get a boot that is wide enough for my foot. So that's another consideration. So there are only a few brands that I can go to. And I do also find that the leather boots, the fit isn't as wide as what I need. So that kind of pushes me out while I've got a pair of leather boots. For that reason, they're not as comfortable as those Gore-Tex type boots. So, and then the other thing is you have to think about, so the fit is important. The other thing is the trails that you're walking on. What's the predominant trail that you'll be, trail type that you'll be using, and what kind of footwear is suitable for that?
And I think for people first starting hiking, it's going to depend on what you go for will depend on a couple of things. When you first start hiking, just grab a pair of old runners out of the cupboard, not the brand new ones. Have a play, see what you think. They're not giving you enough support or they're not giving you enough traction. Maybe you want something heavier. Don't go out and buy a brand new pair of hiking footwear without saying, A, you like it, and B, what sort of hiking are you going to be doing? Yeah,
and I think, you can get lots of good advice in the outdoor stores, but they do, in my experience, they do tend to push you into two kind of places. One is the boot of different kinds, and the other one is the hiking shoe that we talked about, which is the sturdy looking runner with the really poorly gripping sole. Again, I just don't get the poorly gripping sole, but yeah.
And I think, if you've got friends that are into hiking and they make recommendations, it'll often be what they tend to use as a starting point.
Yeah, because it's about me, not about you.
Yeah. If you go into a store, again, it depends on whether they will always sell boots. They won't necessarily sell trail runners. So you'll find you'll often start somewhere. And I must admit, this is probably not a bad place if you're going to buy a pair of new shoes for hiking, is maybe buy one of the lightweight pair of boots and then think, well, okay, this isn't giving me enough support or it's not giving me enough protection. You'll go heavier into one of the heavier boots, or you don't mind it, but you wouldn't mind a bit more mobility and freedom, and then you'll shift towards the trail runner style. So I think that's one of the big pluses of the trail runner style of boots, that it's a good starting place to go through and work with.
Yeah. And look, I just keep coming back to, not everybody can have a cupboard full of hiking boots and shoes. So primary considerations are comfort, what's comfort, what's comfortable for you, and match that with the type of trail that you'll mostly be walking on.
And I think, in all honesty, if you get really into hiking, you're likely to own a couple of different options. So the one, whether it be a boot or a trail runner, you use most of the time, and then you might use a lighter or heavier version for the occasional times you do hit the snow, or you really groomed sort of trail that's easy to walk on, and you don't mind having less protection that is often offered by a trail runner. So I suppose the answer to this question, and we probably really haven't answered this here, there is no one choice and there is no right answer.
The answer is it depends.
Yeah, the answer is it depends. So, as I said, I very much fall into the trail runner camp, but I do own and I do use boots occasionally, but it's rare. I've seen most other people, particularly if they've been hiking for a long time, it's hard to convince people to shift across to trail runners. But the other thing I'd also mention here as well is, as you get older and it becomes a bit harder to hike, having a bit more freedom and mobility is not a bad thing. rather than having something that's going to bog you down because it's so heavy. But again, on the plus side, it gives you more support. So if you're more likely to fall, it's not a bad option to have that bit more stability. Okay, we hope you've enjoyed this episode, and I'm sure it hasn't really cleared up the answer here, but we hope it has given you some food for thought, and it might steer you in a direction about what you might go through and look at. That's all for me. Bye for now.
And bye from me.